The eighth and final volume of my autobiography, to the age of 30, is called Becoming an Anthropologist and describes my life from 1966 to 1971, when I converted from being a historian to an anthropologist. The first part of this conversion was a 2-year master's at the London School of Economics, and I had some excellent teachers, among them the head of the department, Sir Raymond Firth, one of Malinowski's pupils, and my supervisor, Isaac Shapiro, Robin Fox, many other distinguished anthropologists. And I had some close friends who were doing field work, who would come back from field work. So I became immersed in anthropology, and after 2 years I took my final exams as a MPhil student and got my mastership. So this was my second master's, and meant that I was now trained to do fieldwork. Alongside, I didn't find this particularly arduous, and I finished off my DPhil and had it examined and started to turn it into a book on witchcraft. And I also became very interested in a 17th century diarist, Ralph Jocelyn, and assembled a rough book on the family life of Ralph Jocelyn, a 17th century clergyman, which I'd sketched out, and then my mother made a huge contribution in improving, and particularly while I was away in Nepal. So this meant that while I was in Nepal, 2 books were getting ready and were published when I came back, which made a huge difference when I started to apply for jobs. I needed to move from the LSE because I was wanting to work in the Burma border area, northeast India, and the obvious person to supervise me was Christoph von Führer-Heimendorf. This rather hazy picture of him as an elderly man doesn't do justice to one of the great ethnographers and filmmakers of the 20th century. He advised me, after it was clear I couldn't go to the Naga Hills because of political troubles, to follow up the work of Bernard Pignade on the Gurungs. The Gurungs were people who lived in central Nepal, and Pignade had written an excellent monograph on them, but only covering some of their life before he tragically died very young. So Heimendorf had been to this area and said, why don't you go to Nepal and the Gurungs? And this is where they are located. I didn't even know where Nepal was, and obviously knew nothing about the Gurungs. But one of the good aspects of a good supervisor is he determines the shape of what you might profitably study for 3 years. So he said, go to Siklis in Gurung area. So the first thing I had to do was to go out to Nepal, and after some weeks get a certain period in Kathmandu and then Pokhara to get permissions to go up into this area. This is my trekking work permit to go up to the north of Pokhara, the second town of Nepal, to spend time with Jill, my then wife, studying the Gurungs. We arrived in Pokhara first, which was at that time very, very quiet and remote. You can see Machu Picchu, the fishtail mountain, in the background, and there were only about 6 or 7 cars and 3 or 4 hotels in a place which is now a small and bustling city full of traffic. We spent time there assembling what we needed and hiring some porters, and then set out into the unknown. Little did I know how steep the country was. The village we ended up with is up on the top left. There's a slight clearing up there, and that is the village in which I spent with Jill about a year. And this final bit up to that was more or less a sheer cliff. Behind it was the Annapurna range of the mountains, which were very beautiful, and it was a wonderful setting physically. here is a much later photograph taken 30 or 40 years later when I went back there, and you see Annapurna 4 behind, and the village of Siklis in the far, far distance, just underneath Annapurna. We never reached that far because we were exhausted by the first climbs, so we fortunately stayed in a village much closer to Pokhara, though still far enough away, because everything we needed had to be carried either by porters or by ourselves. So we would go down to Pokhara every 2 or 3 weeks or months to collect things, just a few tins of this and that, because there was hardly anything in the bazaar. Almost everything had to be bought in the village, and it was extremely simple living. But here are Jill and I setting out actually to the north probably on a picnic and washing our clothes. The village itself was a village of about 1,000 people. This is one of the main village streets, and we stayed up towards the left, and you see the normal, very everyday life of a hill village. A lot of the men were away in the army and elsewhere, so it was predominantly filled with women. Our little house on the right here, we rented from the family of whom the daughter is in the front, and so we spent a year amidst the smoke and chatter of this house, with beyond it the night school, as it was called. Very, very simple house, Gurung house with a slated roof. Many of the houses had slated roofs, and houses spread up the hillside. Our house is more or less in the middle on the right, where there's some white figures just to the right of that. And for example, when we wanted to go to the toilet, because there were no toilets, you had to climb right up that hillside above for about 10 minutes, quarter of an hour, if you wanted to go to the toilet. This was Jill in front of the village. We were both very young, in our mid-20s at the time, and fairly fit, but not really expecting the shock of the culture shock of loneliness, illness, the simplicity of the life, the absence of privacy. And this account describes all those things in graphic detail, a world which many people would never know. We had to cook for ourselves, and often surrounded by what seemed to be half the village, chatting, observing, laughing at us, speaking in a language which we didn't understand at all. And towards the end, Jill wore a local costume sari, so this is later in the proceedings. There were ways to communicate, and one of the most successful I discovered was that fortunately I'd taken my guitar with me, and so in the evenings over hot chocolate or some other beverage, I would get out my guitar and we would sing folk songs, pick a bale of cotton and so on, and the children would join in and clap and so on. So this showed that I was a human being. The main thing, of course, in anthropology is participant observation. You have to actually go down and be with the people. Here Jill is dehusking maize in front of our house. So occasionally we would actually do something useful in terms of helping. But on this occasion, it's just one small example. And so other times I would go down to the fields and observe, which was the other part of participation. Here I'm on the edge of a rice terrace while the workers are having their midday picnic, and I'm doing the same. Very hot, and clearly I was unlikely to be doing anything much in the rice fields myself, which was extremely difficult work. Part of the problem I faced was how to organize my writing up and my writing, because there was very little space and privacy, but I did manage to set up a desk in the attic of our little house. It took me about 4 months to get this little table made, extremely cramped as you see, but I could keep a few folders and files around me and write reports to my supervisor and drafts of bits and pieces of that, and also have some of my informants up in a private space to talk to me. The main source again for this account are written records. This is part of the diary which I kept Friday the 27th of June, a little rain, many people returning from the fields for lack of water. I did a couple of hours with Bol Bahadur, also 5 pages of Pinyin translation, which we were doing at that time. So this goes right through the whole time, and Jill, my wife, kept a diary for part of it. So this gives the day-by-day backbone of our time there. And alongside this were long letters I wrote and kept carbon copies of to my mother in particular, but also to other friends, people at the LSE I got to know, my supervisor. And this begins the beginning of analysis, the distribution of land and crops, labour expenditure, and all those topics which I wrote about in my letters. I also kept field notes, just jottings, talk to the health worker about village health. He goes around visiting each house in turn and talking to them about family planning. So you keep diaries, you keep field notes. But again, there's the question of how you analyze all this material. And I used the same method as I used in my history DPhil, which was to write some of the materials onto small cards. Attitudes to romantic love, a conversation I'd had. Falling in love, Prasad thinks, is not so good, and there is no need for it, no word for it. Weddings and so on, and I put these under headings and used them in my writing up. The central core of my thesis was the relation between resources and population, so much of the work was around a detailed census I did. This is the printed version of part of it, which I used when I went round 100 families and asked them these questions. Have you been to school? If so, for how many years? And so on. So there were questions beyond population and economics. And this was very valuable material when I came to write my thesis. As well as keeping notebooks and so on, towards the end, I had a small camera without sound and without zoom and just very small snippets. But looking back at this, and links to this are included in the book because it's up on the web, gives you sometimes an insight into things you'd completely forgotten, and life in a very remote Himalayan village at that time in the late 1960s. I also, at the encouragement of my supervisor Heimendorf, had a tape recorder, so the book also has bits of sound from girls talking, girls and singing, being taught the Gurung language. So basically linguistic and musical work were particularly good for this tape recorder. One of the things that anthropologists have to do, above all, is to master the relationships in a village like this, and many of them are family relationships. So you have to get the terms of reference in the local language for a mother's brother, a father's father, and so on and so on. And also the terms of address, how you actually call someone. And once you have those, you can begin to understand little bits. All these people here, more or less, are related to each other, Jill in the background, and they interact daily, and much of that is affected by family and kinship. So family and kinship is, for many people working in these kinds of communities, the heart, and the anthropology has probably contributed most in its study of different family systems around the world. immensely complicated. This is a later, on a return to the village, but it shows a reconstruction of part of one of the lineages in the village, going back some generations, because people's genealogical knowledge is very good. And so you can then see who is related now through past marriages and births. I was particularly helped by a retired lieutenant in the British Army, Gurkhas, Bowen Singh, who's at the top there. This is the wedding of his son, Nandalal. And Nandalal died a few years afterwards, and I became a kind of adopted son. I was adopted into this family with Jill, so I called them by kinship terms, and the young girl in white became my chief informant and the centre of a lot of my work. Alongside population, the study of the agricultural system was at the heart of my work. An amazing system on a hillside steeper than any mountain in the United Kingdom, for example, and they were doing this terraced rice cultivation down to the river far below, going down, working in the fields and carrying these heavy loads up again. And so I tried to reconstruct the whole field system, who owned every field, not only now in the present, but over the last few generations, to see the patterns of land ownership and rice productivity and what they grew and how they divided it up among their families. Everything, of course, is collaborative in such fieldwork. You depend entirely on the community. And so from time to time I'd gather together the senior members of the village, the most knowledgeable people, Bowen Singh on the right, the head of the local panchayat on the left, and me with my back, and we would be working on this map that we've just seen with unemployed youth watching on. And so they gave an enormous amount of help. And then, of course, alongside this, there was going out with them up into the woods above the forest above the village here, and hoeing. It was too high really to plough, and they were hoeing and planting various vegetables up in the forest. So we would go with them to watch and observe, time, question what they were doing, how they were doing it. So the labour input-output became a very central feature of this detailed study. I was fortunate to find some excellent land records going back nearly 100 years of each piece of land. It was a terribly complicated jigsaw puzzle, and I had to go through this day after day after day, transcribing these ancient records. But it did give me time depth of a kind which is unusual in these kinds of studies. So landholding was one of the central parts of it. Another was exactly how much they bought and sold, their whole domestic economics. So this takes 10 families and looks at how much chili powder they bought, how much sugar, how much salt, so that you could see whether they were making profits, how the pension system from the British Gurkhas worked out in the village, and so on. Particularly important were several families who helped me to produce a diary of what they did each day, their work diary, washed clothes, ploughed for maize, fetched grass from the forest. Each member of 2 or 3 households came in the evening, or their children came and told me what they'd been doing that day. So this is a daily diary of 3 or 4 Gurung families. Also, you needed to know exactly what they owned and what they bought in the local bazaar in Pokhara. And so these are, I did inventories of possessions of selected households, how much they're buying, how much they're selling, and what they own. And you began to realize that they had very little in the way of possessions. They weren't at all rich even though they were rich in Nepalese standards. And here again, these are economic analyses. All this has to be analysed when you come home and is extremely detailed. My final book was filled with tables analysing all this. So as a historical document of life at that time, it contains a lot of data. I did other kinds of surveys. With the help of the local mission doctor from the hospital, we did a short 2-day survey of various ailments and illnesses, goiters, coughing, eye infections, and so on, to see what the health condition of a village was. Hardly anyone has ever done that, and later I wrote it up as an article. And also I worked with the schoolmasters and set essays, competitions, drawing competitions, and this is an analysis of some of the essays. What are you most frightened of? Who is the person you like most? What would you like to be when you grow up, and so on. So these are revealing. These are 10, 12, 14-year-olds. The most interesting part, apart from the formal thing I was studying, was ritual and religion. This is a sacred dance which young girls perform, the Gato Sheba, which goes on for 3 days and 3 nights in its full performance, and the girls often go into trance. Later I filmed this. It's nearly died out in this area, and it's died out in this village, but I have film and documentation of this. It's quite a shock going to such a place, because I'd never seen a dead body, let alone a dead body being burnt down by the river in the Hindu cremation, and the smell and sound of burning flesh was a shock. The funeral itself, such as this, is quite quick, but then they have a very elaborate 3-day ritual to celebrate the memory of the person and to take them to the land of the dead. The Gurungs are shamanic, they're Buddhist, they're Hindu, and here is a Hindu ritual, the killing of a small buffalo at the Durga Puja at the little shrine at the bottom of the village. So this mixture of religions was a shock and surprise to me, and challenged all my monotheistic beliefs. They're perhaps most interesting for having preserved an ancient form of shamanism coming down from northern China and still using ancient language which most people don't understand. And here is the small family of the shamans, my chief informant in the cap second from the right, and my closest friend on the left, his son, both of whom gave me enormous amount of help in transcribing and preserving some of their ancient myths and legends. The shaman himself made, among other things, wood prints to put on your door to prevent witches and evil spirits coming along. So although this wasn't my central task, and I hadn't expected to devote much attention to it, I did spend a lot of time, particularly in the last 3 months, because I realized how this in many ways was the most exciting and interesting thing about these people. So I did an analysis of religion, the local gods and spirits who are outlined here. The place was just infested with magic and little spirits in the rocks and trees and stones. And so I encountered a magical, shamanic, animistic world, which later would help me to understand Japan and China. Although it was extremely difficult to be there, when the time came for us to leave, I'm on the centre right, garlanded there, and Jill beside me. It was one of the most shattering experiences of my life. One didn't realise how closely one had become entangled with the village, and it was really traumatic, and I hardly remember those 2 or 3 days as we left. And as we left the village itself, as happened many times later on our revisits, the whole village would come and follow us with the band playing, and then stand on the hillside, and we would walk down, and every time we turned round 10 or 20 minutes further down the hillside, we would see them still waving and calling from above. And so they became really very, very close to us. When you go back home, it's a reverse culture shock, of course, and then you have the long process of writing the thesis, which I did in a small Yorkshire village in this house, on the top floor of this house. And you then live this double world of being in England, but also your mind and heart and imagination and work being in Nepal. So you reconstruct, you imagine the village a second time. I did do this, and the thesis was very long and detailed and successful, and I finally got my second doctorate of philosophy from the School of Oriental and African Studies only after I'd actually gone to Cambridge for a year or two, when I'd finished writing it up. It was very dry and a matter of fact, but through the enormous support of Professor Jack Goody, who was the liaison with Cambridge University Press, it was published in 1976 as Resources and Population, a study of the Gurungs of Nepal, and gave me my credentials in anthropology. This is actually a family in another village, but a nice photograph. And so I'd finished my education, my formal education, at the age of 30, and I now went off to start the next part of my life as a senior research fellow at King's College, Cambridge. And now I had 2 master's degrees, 2 PhDs, experience of another civilization and society, and was ready to get embarked on further research all over the world, and writing and teaching and administration. Thank you.